to maintain and preserve records. The Code of Federal Regulations says that basically all information created, regardless of physical form or characteristics, made or received by an agency in connection with the transaction of our business, as evidence of our organization, our functions, our policies, our decisions, our procedures, our operations, and our other activities, are all federal records. Recently, ISO 9000 implementation across the agency has heightened NASA employees' awareness of records management. The agency has specific guidelines for how to care for our records and when and how to retire them from active use. Your center has a records manager who can assist you with guidance in this area. Other than ISO 9000 emphasis on records control, why should we be concerned about our records at NASA? First, we're required by the Code of Federal Regulations and agency directives to identify and manage records and to conduct regular reviews to assure our compliance. Second, good records management allows operational efficiencies through, number one, facilitating accessibility to and reportability of data and information. Good records management provides operational efficiency through space conservation. For example, from April '99 through March of this year, NASA shipped some 7,228 boxes of records into retirement, either in local records facilities or the federal record centers. Another reason for it is to have good records management also facilitates program reference and guidance for both our civil service and contractor employees. In the same one-year period I just mentioned, we retrieved records 2,033 times for civil service and contractor personnel who needed to reference older records. The third reason to manage our records is our public accountability. Since our work is paid for by public dollars, we are not only expected, but also, as I said earlier, required to be good stewards of public trust and funds, as exemplified by good records management. And finally, there's the historical benefit. Well-managed and preserved records provide valuable experience upon which the next generation of our engineers and scientists can build. But they also provide a rich resource for historical references, manifesting themselves in such things as books, articles, documents, movies such as Apollo 13, and miniseries such as the Tom Hanks From the Earth to the Moon. Which brings me to the introduction of our guest. Andrew Chaikin is the author of the critically acclaimed book, A Man on the Moon, that was the inspiration for and the basis of the Emmy Award-winning HBO miniseries From the Earth to the Moon. Mr. Chaikin, who says he has been in love with the sky and with space explorations since he was 5 years old, spent 8 years researching and writing this definitive account of our Apollo missions. He is also the author of Air and Space, the National Air and Space Museum Story of Flight. He collaborated with astronaut Alan Bean to write Apollo and an eyewitness account. And he's also the former editor of Sky and Telescope magazine. Our guest has been writing about space exploration and astronomy for nearly 2 decades. Mr. Chaikin has written for Newsweek, Air and Space, Smithsonian, Scientific America, and other publications. He is currently a contributing editor of Popular Science, a commentator for the National Public Radio's Morning Edition, and is the executive editor for Space and Science for Space.com, where he oversees the direction and content of the space exploration and space science section of the website. Prior to launching his career as a scientist journalist, Mr. Chaikin was a researcher at the Smithsonian's Center for Earth and Planetary Studies, and before that, he was one of us, working on the Viking missions to Mars at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Following his talk, Mr. Chaikin will be available in the Building 3 cafeteria here at JSC to sign copies of his book that is available for sale right there at the cafeteria. There are 2 versions of his book available, the original paperback edition and a beautiful Time Life 3-volume set. Now let's give Mr. Chaikin a warm welcome. Mr. Andrew Chaikin.
Thanks very much. That was a very nice introduction, although I have to say that I feel honored to be called one of you. I'm not sure that would really stand up, since I was about 21 at the time and was an undergraduate student in geology when I participated in the Viking missions. But you know, I am here as one of you in the sense that space has always been at the center of my life. Growing up with the space program, it was the most exciting thing. It was pretty much the space program and the Beatles, okay? And you know, I was in grade school when the two-man Gemini flights were going on, and I was 13 when Apollo 11 succeeded in accomplishing John F. Kennedy's goal of landing human beings on the moon and returning them safely to Earth. At that time, if you had asked me, what do you want to do with your life? You know, if I hadn't said, well, I want to be a rock singer, what I really would have said was I want to be an astronaut. And that's where my heart and soul was aimed. I would still go into space given the chance in a heartbeat, but I never would have thought that I would grow up to become a journalist. But in a sense, it's actually kind of makes sense in a logical way. You all know about propulsion, and you understand the results of lighting a fire and creating a source of energy. Well, the space program created that fire in me, and when I sort of came to grips with the fact that I wasn't going to be an astronaut, what I gravitated into eventually was to tell stories. And so I'm here as a storyteller who has chosen to tell the story of our first voyages away from our home planet. I started out, as the introduction made reference to, at Sky and Telescope magazine, where I learned a bit of the craft of journalism and got my feet wet as a science journalist covering space shuttle missions, which were just getting started, and also the robotic exploration of the planets, particularly the Voyager missions to the outer solar system. It was a few years after that I had the idea in the summer of 1984 to write a book, and it was very natural to focus in on the Apollo missions, which had really never been written about in a way that satisfied me as a true space fanatic. I wanted a book that would put me into the astronauts' heads, that would let me go along with them to the moon and understand what they thought, what they felt. And I hadn't seen a book like that yet, and I felt ambitious enough to try and do that. And so I made put a few feelers out. I started to talk to some of the geologists who worked on the program, since my background was in geology, and I spoke their language, so I could kind of use that as an entryway. I talked to a few of the flight controllers and some of the Capcoms who had served on the Apollo missions, and then I really got serious and decided I would start pursuing the crews themselves. And so it was that in June of 1985, I stood in Pete Conrad's office in Long Beach, California, as he was then an executive vice president at McDonnell Douglas, and had already gone through the various hoops of writing the letter and the phone calls and arranging for the interview and convincing him that I was serious about this. And any of you who have ever seen Pete in action know that that was a wonderful experience, to sit down with him and hear him tell stories, not only of Apollo 12, which was the second lunar landing and which he commanded, but also of his experiences in the Gemini flights and even before then as a test pilot. Pete was a born storyteller every bit as much as he was a born pilot. And I was fortunate enough to spend several days talking to him. Actually, I had already concluded that Apollo 12 was the place to start my enormous tome of research because I had been reading here at JSC. I had gone to the history office, which was like Disneyland, basically, for me, with all the transcripts from the not only the air-to-ground communications, but the onboard voice tapes. And I found out, my God, there were these tapes that were running in the spacecraft when the astronauts weren't talking to mission control, when they were just talking to each other. I never even knew these existed until I came to JSC in 1984 and was graciously given access and introduced to them by the people in the history office here, including a wonderful fellow named David Compton, who was then writing a book about the scientific missions of Apollo. But anyway, I had read the onboard voice transcripts from Apollo 12 and the debriefings from Apollo 12, and they were so colorful that I figured even if I don't get to interview these guys, I'll have a great story because they were so much fun to read. Well, at this point, when I finally went to see Pete, I had been through the transcripts, the onboard voice transcripts, the technical debriefing that they gave after they came back, everything I could find that they had written, their articles in Life magazine that they'd written when they came back. I'd watched videotape of their in-flight television transmissions. You know, I'd read the press conferences, everything I could get my hands on. And I'd talked to, as I say, a few participants in the mission. So, you know, I felt that this was just necessary baseline preparation. And then there I was sitting with Pete, and half the time I would ask him a question and he would say, I don't remember. You know, it was basically his life had moved on, and Skylab had replaced Apollo 12, and then after Skylab, life after the space program had replaced all of that. So even though Pete had a wonderful memory and told me stories that I had never knew to even ask about, there were a lot of details that he didn't remember, and obviously, and in fact, he would say to me, you know the flight better than I do. And I will never forget the experience of sitting with Pete and also Dick Gordon, who was on Apollo 12 and had an office in the LA area at that time. And I was telling Pete and Dick that I was having some difficulty convincing Alan Bean, the third member of the crew, to spend some time with me. Now, this was understandable in Alan's defense. Alan had left the space program to become a painter and had dedicated his new life to recording on canvas all the adventures of the Apollo astronauts on the moon. And he felt a sense of obligation, a mission to make as many paintings as he possibly could in the rest of his lifetime. So he was not, his first priority was not to set aside several hours to talk to me about Apollo 12. Well, when I told this to Pete and Dick, Pete said, let's call him. And he got up and he went to his phone, he put it on speakerphone, and I heard him dial Alan's number, and Alan answered, hello, and Pete said, Captain Bean, we got a young man in our office here who says he wants to write a book and you won't talk to him. And at this point, this was not just anybody talking to Alan Bean, this was his commander. So things changed for the better at that point. And I remember Alan, I've actually got this on tape somewhere, I remember Alan saying, well, has he read the transcripts and everything? And Pete said, he's memorized it. He said, he doesn't need to read it, you need to read it. So, very clearly, I was someone coming into their life who didn't have much of a life, except for Apollo, but that was my life. And I had really, I'd done my best to convince them that I had done my homework. And so as time went on, the astronauts would tell each other about my project on my behalf, and I was able to convince all of them to talk to me. The only one that I didn't get to talk to was Jack Swigert, who had died in 1982. But the other 23 lunar astronauts and several of the Earth orbit astronauts from Apollo I sat with and talked to on the phone and in person for many hours, total of hundreds of hours of interviews. And some of them took years to get to. I mean, you know, we all know that Neil Armstrong does not like to do interviews, but he was easy compared to Ken Mattingly. I mean, it took me 6 years to get to Ken Mattingly, and Ken laughs every time I tell the story now and is glad that I pestered him. But at the time, it was a little bit touch and go. Well, it all worked out. And let me show you, if we can bring the house lights down a little bit, let me show you a little bit of the fruits of my labor here. This is a picture that I show to kind of symbolize the mission that I undertook. It's a picture of Jack Schmitt on the moon during Apollo 17 with the flag, and of course, in the distance, about 235,000 miles away, is the Earth. And it's a fantastic picture. In fact, Gene Cernan, in order to take this picture, had to take the camera off the bracket on his chest pack and hold it down around the level of his knees to get this shot. Just worked out really well. But the reason I use this picture is to point out that you cannot see Jack's face in this picture. It is hidden by a reflective visor, just as most pictures of astronauts doing spacewalks or moonwalks look. You do not get a sense of the human being within the spacesuit who is having this magnificent adventure. And that was a story that I wanted to tell. And by the way, it was a story that captivated another friend of mine named Tom Hanks, who is seen here on the set of the miniseries From the Earth to the Moon. And Tom and I are the same age, pretty much, and grew up in the same way, just in love with the space program. And so motivated by it that in our adult lives we chose to tell that story. This, of course, is the Saturn V, and the largest rocket ever successfully flown. It's sort of a monument to the audacity of trying to send human beings to the moon in the 1960s, that wonderful dream, which is the fruit of a lot of hard work of engineers, design, test, fabrication, millions of parts in each Saturn V that had to work perfectly. What I found as I started to talk to the astronauts was that there were some interesting stories associated with this. In particular, I'm thinking of the launch of Apollo 8, which was the first crew to ride the Saturn V. And, you know, on that flight was Frank Borman, who had flown Gemini 7 and had stayed up for 2 weeks in a cabin the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, and Jim Lovell, who had flown with him, and the two of them had battled all kinds of malfunctions, fuel cells conking out on them. You know, Chris Kraft was on the radio on the other end in mission control, convincing them to go another day and keep going, and so they were seasoned space veterans. And then the third guy on the crew was Bill Anders, who was a rookie at that time. Of course, he said, when it comes to going to the moon, no rookie. But what I found was very interesting, because if you read the technical debriefing that the astronauts gave, which again I got from the history office, and you read Bill's comments about the launch, here they are, the first human beings to ride the Saturn V. The thing generates 7.5 million pounds of thrust at liftoff. And Bill was describing the first moments of the launch, and he said, you know, he's talking to other astronauts at this point. He said, yes, I noticed some very positive control motions during the first phases of the powered flight. Well, when I talked to him, you know, some 15, 16 years later, what he said was, yeah, I felt like I was a rat in the mouth of a giant dog, and I was being shaken within an inch of my life, basically. So not everything came through in those transcripts, but... Well, the magnificent ride that put them on a course to the moon also gave them this view of the Earth. This was a picture from Apollo 16 that was taken by Ken Mattingly, and it's probably my favorite Earth picture from the whole program. Just a gorgeous view of North America, and of course, Bill Muhlberger, who's in the audience and trained the Apollo 16 crew, will remember that John Young gave him a copy of this picture. You can see the whole of California there, along with a lot of other things, and said, "See, Bill, there's where you took us on geology training, the Oricopia Mountains. Thanks for a great trip." You know, it's just an incredible change in perspective, a beautiful picture. But what Ken Mattingly told me was that he would look out the window at something like this, and he said, "I almost didn't want to look, because I knew that it was going to be so spectacular that it was going to erase all the memories I had up to that point." So an astronaut on a moon trip just had almost more than the human being can stand in terms of things to remember. A great picture from Apollo 17. I leave it to you to decide who's right side up and who's upside down. That's Gene Cernan on the left and Ron Evans on the right. This illustrates the delights of weightlessness. If you'd like to know more about the dark side of weightlessness, I recommend to you the chapter on Apollo 8, which covers the time-honored question of the bathroom facilities aboard Apollo, which were at best rudimentary, and the unfortunate effects of motion sickness on one Frank Borman, but I will not go into detail at this time. Boy, if you get some Apollo fans together in a room, and if they have any kind of engineering interest, the talk will soon go to the lunar module. This is the Apollo 11 lunar module, just a couple of hours before that historic lunar touchdown. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had just separated from Mike Collins and were kind of doing a pirouette in front of the command module so that Mike could take some pictures. The lunar module, or the LEM, as we Apollo types call it, was an absolute marvel of engineering. Just when you think of human ingenuity made visible, this is what I think of. It was the first true spacecraft in the sense that it was only designed to fly in space. It had no heat shield, it had no aerodynamics, because it was never going to come back to Earth. In fact, the only LEM that did go to the moon and return to the vicinity of the Earth was the Apollo 13 lunar module, which saved the lives of the astronauts after they had an explosion in their service module. But the lunar module has all of these amazing parts and pieces that were designed to be as lightweight as possible and still do the job. If you look at the descent stage, the bottom half of the lander, it's all covered in metal-coated plastic, mylar and Kapton insulation, no real walls to speak of. The upper part, the ascent stage where the crew was during the flight, some of the walls were so thick that if you dropped a hammer or a screwdriver during testing on Earth, you could put a hole in the cabin. You know, this was a truly remarkable creation. And it was quite fascinating to hear the astronauts talk about how it flew. It's basically balanced on the thrust of its rocket engine. If you remember from the old, Ed Sullivan show type magicians with the spinning plates on top of a broomstick and how hard that was to kind of control, think of that same kind of principle when you think of flying a lunar module down to the surface of the moon. Now, if you look at the landings on the moon, almost every one of them had some heart-stopping moment. During Apollo 11, it was a computer alarm that almost threatened to abort the mission, and then right after that, Neil Armstrong had to avoid a crater the size of a football field that was surrounded by boulders. On Apollo 14, when Alan Shepard was landing the lunar module with Ed Mitchell, they had a problem with the landing radar, which did not lock up, did not get into synchronization with the computer when it was supposed to. And there was a mission rule that said if they got down below a certain altitude, I think it was about 11,000 or 13,000 feet, maybe it was 20,000 feet, they would have to abort the mission. Well, the landing radar hadn't come in. Finally, somebody in mission control looking at the data said, tell them to cycle the landing radar circuit breaker, which they did, and they got their data, and they kept going. And I remember interviewing Alan Shepard about this, because, they had done Shepard and Mitchell were pretty aggressive as a pair of pilots. They wanted to get down to the surface of the moon. This was not the first landing. This was going to be the third landing, and by God, they were going to make it no matter what happened. They'd even trained on what to do if the computer went out and they had to fly it themselves, including running the throttle and the attitude at the same time, which is something you never wanted to do manually, but they trained to do it. Anyway, after this radar problem, they got down to the surface, and they were safely on the moon, and Mitchell turned to Shepard. This is Alan Shepard telling me this story. He said, Ed turned to me and he said, "What would you have done?" Meaning, what would you have done if the radar hadn't come in? And Shepard looked at him and he said, "You'll never know." Well, here is probably one of the most famous pictures from the whole space program of Buzz Aldrin standing on the Sea of Tranquility on July 20th, 1969. It's a very impressive, memorable picture, but it also shows some very interesting things about the moon. In this one picture, you can tell a lot about what the moon is like. You can see that it's covered with very fine-grained powder, which is the result of billions of years of bombardment by micrometeorites, which grind the rock down into powder. You can see that the sky is black because there's no atmosphere to scatter sunlight. A lot of things like that. What you can't see in this picture is something that Buzz told me when I interviewed him in 1987. The moon is roughly one quarter the size of the Earth. That is small enough that when Buzz was walking around on the Sea of Tranquility, and by the way, that is relatively speaking, that is a flat part of the moon, he could see, as he moved around, that the ground was curving very subtly away from him in all directions. In other words, he could tell with his own senses that he and Neil were standing on a sphere. Now, that is not an experience that we get on Earth. Well, we move ahead now to Apollo 16, which I show this picture to represent the last three Apollo flights, which were the extended scientific missions to the moon, featured all kinds of improvements. John Young is so happy to be on the moon in this picture that he has jumped 4 feet off the ground. I don't know if you can tell that looking at this picture, but he is in midair, or mid-vacuum, I guess you'd have to say, on the moon, effortlessly in lunar gravity, even though he and his spacesuit weigh in excess of 300 pounds on the Earth. On the moon, it would be roughly 50 pounds because of the moon's 1/6 gravity. So this is one happy camper when Charlie Duke took this picture. But the reason I show this picture is to highlight the spacesuit which Captain Young is modeling for us today, which is the improved J-Mission series spacesuit, which featured extra oxygen and cooling water to allow a moonwalk of up to 7 hours, a full working day out on the surface of the moon. The lunar module had extra supplies to allow them to stay on the moon for 3 full days. That's not staying on the moon, that's living on the moon, living on the surface of another world. The coolest part, of course, was over at the left there, the lunar rover, which was a spacecraft on wheels and gave the astronauts the ability to travel for miles across the surface of the moon in search of geologic treasure, which they found in abundance in places like this, where we are now in the valley called Hadley Apennine. Those mountains in the background are part of the Apennine Mountains that are adjacent to the Sea of Rains on the moon. And they were not only geologically spectacular, but visually spectacular. Some of the most beautiful places, as John Young said, where he was on the Descartes Highlands, one of the most dazzlingly beautiful places ever visited by human beings. The astronauts visited some absolutely amazing vistas like this one. They're actually up on the side of one of the mountains here, looking down the slope at a giant canyon called Hadley Rill. One of my favorite stories was told by one of the geologists who was at a briefing that was given to the astronauts of Apollo 15, Dave Scott and Jim Irwin, before they flew. And, you know, Dave and Jim got very into the geology, very into the science, and they worked very closely with the scientists. And there was one moment at which this was an after-dinner discussion, and the topic turned to Hadley Rill, which was a winding canyon, and nobody was quite sure how it had formed. You know, was it carved by molten lava, or was it a fissure that opened up, or, you know, what was it? Well, Dave Scott at one point said to a geologist named Jim Head, Jim, you know, if we could drive down to the bottom of the rill and look for clues down there, would that be something you'd like for us to do? And Jim Head just about lost it. He said, my God, are you kidding? You could spend the rest of your life down there. When everybody realized what he said, it was a joke that they then told for the next 20 years. But when they got to the moon, they decided not to try going down in there. I showed this picture to tell an interesting story. This is a picture that Dave Scott took up on the side of a mountain called Hadley Delta when they were prospecting for samples. And you can see that Dave is doing a very good job of documenting an unusual boulder which he has found during the drive across the slope. He and Jim Irwin have gotten off the rover, and Dave took this picture, and just to show the size of the boulder, he has put down his sampling tongs on the boulder, just like he was trained to do, and then he will hammer off a piece of this rock and take it back to Earth, and the geologists will have all the evidence they need to figure it out. But that's not why I'm showing you this picture. What I want you to look at is in the background, where the wheels of the rover are off the ground. And the rover is starting to slide downhill. Now, that may not sound that bad, but when you're 3.5 miles away from the lunar module, and your only ticket home is that rover, you do not want to let it slide down the hill and get away from you. So Jim Irwin in the background, this is almost like a scene from a Woody Allen movie, is holding the rover while Dave does his geology work. Now, you all remember these TV pictures from the rover that took us along with the astronauts, and we were able to see them in all of their adventures. But this was a time in the moonwalk when they did not have TV. They were driving across the mountain, and so all that anybody had was the sounds of their voices. And can you imagine what it felt like for the folks in Mission Control to hear, uh-oh, Dave, the rover wheel is sliding. Yeah, okay, Jim, you better hold on to it. I'll get this picture and get this sample. Just hold on, Jim. I'll be right there. Okay, Dave, I got it. Can you imagine how the mission managers felt in the back row of Mission Control, just kind of gritting their teeth? But that was one of my favorite stories. A lot of hard work being on the moon. Very hard work. Physical hard work. The suits were magnificent. In fact, Dave Scott said he would go back to the moon today using one of those suits. They held up through all the wear and tear that the astronauts gave them. But there was one aspect of using the suits that was especially tough, and that was your hands. Any kind of work with your fingers. You can see here that John Young is rolling up a sample bag that's full of lunar dust, and he's going to put it in a special sample container, but right now he's sort of a twist tie kind of a thing where he's rolling it up. And every movement of the fingers within the gloves was hard work. If you want to understand what that's like, next time you have a free moment, pick up a tennis ball and squeeze the tennis ball repeatedly. And after about 15 minutes of this, your arm will start to ache. And if you can imagine doing this for hours on end, that was the kind of physical discomfort that the astronauts had to put up with. Not only that, but the fingers, they wanted to have as much dexterity as they possibly could. And so they made the gloves fit rather tightly. And that meant that when they brought their arms in like this, their fingers would mash up into the ends of the fingers of the gloves. And it was like being hit on the ends of your fingers with a hammer. In fact, when Dave Scott came back from the moon, you can see in pictures of him at the post-flight press conference that several of his fingernails have turned black because of hemorrhaging under the nails. And it was just part of the physical exertion, almost ordeal at times, of being on the moon. But the work was so exciting, the scenery so spectacular, that sort of pushed all of that into the background. And they went about their work with such professionalism and such expertise that I think the geologists who watched them at work felt as if they were very well represented indeed. And finally, they got to send one of their own to the moon. This is Jack Schmitt on the very last Apollo flight, Apollo 17, inspecting some boulders at a place called Taurus Littrow. And you can see that after, I think at this point, a couple of days worth of clambering around on the moon, his once white spacesuit has now turned a rather dusky shade of moon gray. But that indeed was the last Apollo mission. Because of budgetary restrictions, NASA chose to cancel the last 3 Apollo missions. In fact, that's why we have a Saturn V sitting out there on the grounds here at JSC. It was actually built for a moon mission, but the funds for that mission were not available. Well, there was one other thing that I wanted to tell you about that they did on the moon, and that was various missions they did. They did a few things to kind of reflect on the moment. And on Apollo 15, what Dave Scott did was he recreated an experiment that was done by Galileo, in which you drop weights of different masses and show that despite their different masses, they fall at the same speed. Well, Dave's feeling, and actually this was an idea suggested by Joe Allen, who was a physicist and was the mission scientist, why not do it with a hammer and a feather? They have a geology hammer, and Dave, being an Air Force officer, arranged to get a feather from the Falcon that was the Air Force's official mascot Falcon. This was not a situation where they had to sneak up behind the bird and pull a feather out. They shed feathers periodically, and so Dave arranged to get one of these feathers. Dropped the feather. He was a little worried that he wouldn't have time to do it. He told me he really wanted to kind of practice it once or twice behind the lem, out of range of the camera. But when it came right down to it, they were pressed for time. He didn't want to let Joe Allen down. So they just went for the camera, and, it was kind of like, well, I guess, hope this works. He dropped the hammer and the feather, and because there's a vacuum, there's no air resistance to slow down the feather, they both fell at exactly the same speed. And this was recorded on the TV camera. What many of you may not have seen is this picture, which shows the feather on the moon in its final resting place. Dave had hoped to retrieve the feather and bring it back from the moon, but when they got back up into lunar orbit, there was one of those conversations between Dave and Jim Irwin, pretty much to the effect of, I thought you had the feather. Well, on the way back from the moon, on the last 3 missions, the command module pilot, who you may think had the raw end of the deal, not getting to land, but believe me, they had quite an incredible experience of their own. I mean, there they were orbiting the moon by themselves for 3 days. And if that's not a thing of beauty, I don't know what is, to be able to circle silently over those craters and see the changing lighting conditions and be able to float weightlessly within the command module and now be the only person in it. But on the way back from the moon, these guys on the last 3 missions had a chance to make a spacewalk halfway between the moon and the Earth to retrieve the scientific film that they had shot in lunar orbit. So you have to understand, this is a truly science fiction experience. The Earth is a little ball off in one direction. The moon is a little ball off in the other direction. The sun is just a brilliant, brilliant beacon in a black sky. And, on TV, all you hear is very technical conversation and, yes, Houston, I've got the film canister, I'm coming in now. But you notice that there's a second astronaut standing in the hatchway, floating in the hatchway to help the command module pilot with his umbilical. Well, on Apollo 16, the command module pilot was Ken Mattingly, and the command module pilot was Charlie Duke, a South Carolina native, and with an appreciable southern drawl. And on the air to ground, all you hear is Ken Mattingly's voice talking about the progress of the spacewalk. But on the onboard voice tapes, you have Charlie Duke's commentary. And most of what Charlie Duke was saying was, my God, it's dark out here. And this sounds funny to us, you know, kind of hearing the story, but the effect it had on Ken Mattingly at the time was not completely positive. Because Ken was looking around and told me that he kind of looked over the edge of the service module and felt as if he were looking into an abyss, could see absolutely nothing but blackness. And he told me that if it hadn't been for the gloves, he was squeezing the handrails so tight he would have left fingerprints. So, you know, fantastic stories, probably, as I say, the most science fiction experience of all. And, you know, as I say, Apollo ended after Apollo 17. I think just about everybody who was working on the program felt that it ended too soon. But, you know, one thing that nobody really understood at the time, I don't think, was that the conditions that gave rise to Apollo were unique, almost a historical fluke. The combination of the Cold War pressure to impress the world with a space mission, the technology to go to the moon had just become available, and we had a young president who was captivated by the drama and the excitement of space exploration and made it a national goal. So we look back on Apollo. I like what Gene Cernan has said, which is that it's almost as if John Kennedy seized a decade out of the 21st century and spliced it into the 1960s. That we almost had a glimpse, or in fact we did have a glimpse of our future in space, and we had it 30 years ago. And for now, there's pictures like this one which show the moon as seen, the Earth as seen from the surface of the moon, that remind us what we did and what we will do again. Now, as I've tried to share with you, my conversations with the astronauts were certainly rewarding and were among the most remarkable experiences that I've had as a journalist. But I could not have written this book, and I could not have turned it into the story that I wanted to tell, with the detail I wanted to tell and the immediacy I wanted to tell, without an awful lot of other sources. And I'm talking about, as I say, the transcripts, thousands of pages of transcripts, briefing books, training manuals, memos, inter-office memos from the Manned Spacecraft Center at the time and other NASA centers, post-mission reports, handwritten notes from meetings, audio tape of the astronauts' conversations, videotapes, all of these things, and I'm leaving out all kinds of different materials that I used. All of these things were available to me because Apollo, like the rest of the country's civilian space program, is an open program. And we did this bold adventure of sending humans to the moon, not behind closed doors, but before the eyes of the world. And in an amazing stroke of good fortune for somebody like me, a storyteller, it was done within an engineering culture that devotes itself to recording detail. So there is so much documentation of the Apollo missions that they surely are the best documented voyages of exploration in history. So I benefited from that. I benefited from the great generosity of Janet Kovacevic and others at the time in the NASA History Office. And all of these things, of course, were crucial because the memories of the participants can be flawed. You cannot depend on your own memory from something that happened last year, let alone 15 years or 20 years ago. One of the things that Stu Ruza from Apollo 14 told me many times was that one of his great regrets from the space program was that he never kept a diary. He was a little bit busy. It's understandable. But all those years later, that was something that he did regret. And sometimes these little memory gaps became important in the telling of the story. And I will just tell you very briefly about one particular photograph, which happens to be one of the most famous photographs of the 20th century. In fact, Time magazine recently put out a book of the greatest photographs of the 20th century, and this was the photograph they put on the cover. It's the very first color photo of the Earthrise taken by Apollo 8 in lunar orbit on Christmas Eve of 1968. And when this picture came back, it was obviously very celebrated. It was in Life magazine. The Postal Service turned it into a stamp. I mean, what more can you ask for as a photographer than to have your work turned into a U.S. postage stamp? So you can understand that there would be some pride of authorship of this picture. And you would think that with all the documentation associated with the Apollo missions, that it would be very easy to determine who took the picture. But that would be to ignore the crew dynamics of Apollo 8. Because Frank Borman, as commander of the flight, remembered that he took the picture. And not only did he take the picture, but he had to grab the camera away from Bill Anders to get the picture. Because he insisted that Anders didn't want to take the picture because it wasn't a scientific photo and all his pictures were reserved for scientific purposes. And Borman said, "Darn it, Bill," I'm paraphrasing, "this is the most important picture in this flight. Take that picture." And finally, so, you know, I'd heard the stories over the years. I really wanted to solve this one. This, as a historian, this was a challenge I couldn't resist. So I went to the onboard voice transcripts, and actually it's just, I wasn't even looking for it. I discovered in the history office as I looked through the Apollo 8 onboard voice transcripts that, oh my God, the recorder was running at the moment they saw the Earthrise and took this picture. Unbelievable. Makes sense because the recorder was turned on before they went around the far side, and it was turned off after they came back around. Well, this picture is taken right as they're establishing contact with Earth after coming around the far side. So there it was. But the transcript was ambiguous because somebody looks out the window and says, "My God, there's the Earth coming up, isn't that pretty?" And somebody else says, "Don't take that, it's not scheduled." Okay? There it was in the transcript. Question is, who said what? The transcript says that Frank Borman looked out the window and said, "Oh my God, look at that picture up there." And that Bill Anders said, "Don't take that, it's not scheduled." Well, I wasn't satisfied with that because by this time I'd already interviewed Bill Anders, who had told me he was sure he had taken the picture. So I went, and again, through the wonderful help that I got from the JSC audio division, wonderful people, Deanna Ormsby and Pete Newbile at that time, they got me the tape itself, the actual onboard voice tape. I had them play it for me over the phone before they even sent it to me. And that's how much I wanted to hear it. And I, priding myself on my ear for voices, and if you like, I can treat you to some impressions later, various people within the space program and outside, recognized Bill Anders' voice saying, "Oh my God, look at that picture over there, isn't that pretty?" And Frank Borman, as a joke, saying to Anders, "Don't take that, it's not scheduled," and you can even hear him sort of chuckle a little bit. So the mystery was solved. I got the tape in my hands, I listened to it again and again. It was very, very clear, very clear. Flash forward to 1988, and I'm having dinner with Frank Borman and his wife Susan, and I just interviewed Frank, and we went out for dinner afterwards. And during dinner he said, "You know that picture of the Earthrise? Did I ever tell you that story?" And I said, "No, Frank." So he tells me the story just as I related it to you earlier. You know, I said to Bill, "That's the most important picture of this flight. Take that picture." And he wouldn't, so I grabbed the camera and I took the picture, and that's how it happened. He said, "It's probably in the transcript. Did you read it?" I said, "Yeah, Frank, as a matter of fact, I did." So I broke the news to him. And Susan Borman said, "Frank, you're going to have to apologize to Bill Anders." And just to tell you, just to give you the essence of Frank Borman, he said, "I don't care. I'm not changing my story. It's a good story." Well, so I'm trying to impress upon you that the process of telling a story like this is a process of assembling parts and pieces from all over the place. The details that I could pick up any page of A Man on the Moon and show you that one sentence came from something an astronaut told me, another sentence came from a memo that I got from the archives, another sentence came from, a training manual, and on and on and on. And that these things together become the raw material for the storyteller. Now, you may be thinking, that's fine if you want to spend your life digging into history and telling stories about things that happened a long time ago. Exciting stories nonetheless, but history by now. And you may be thinking, what has all this got to do with me? Well, the answer, of course, is that you are making history right now. You are living through what will become the history of the early 21st century space program. And this was a moment that was envisioned, I go back to the 1950s and the Collier's magazine issues that were illustrated by Chesley Bonestell and written by Werner von Braun and Fred Whipple and others, imagining the space program of the 21st century. Well, here we are, we're living it. And the process that you are going through, that all of you here at NASA and at JSC are going through, is that history in the making. It is probably something, if you're an engineer, you probably don't have time to think about it. You probably are so focused on today's puzzle, trying to accomplish today's mission, or you're designing tomorrow's mission. But I want to urge you to remember that the people who will come after you, whether they are engineers, whether they are scientists, or whether they are storytellers, they will want to know what you did. And they will want to know why you did it. And it is that thought process that is as important to preserve as anything else. Remember that human memory is flawed. And it's wonderful to hear a story over dinner, and it's wonderful to tell stories in a book, but they must be, as much as humanly possible, backed up with recorded facts. I remember when I was a teenager and starting my own Apollo archive, which rapidly began to fill up my room, that occasionally my frustrated mom would utter a phrase, something to the effect of, when in doubt, throw it out. I don't blame her for saying that. She couldn't envision that 25 years later or whatever, I would be making my living off of those archives. But I'm here to tell you that you must not think that way. And there are horror stories. I heard one just the other day of someone who was working on shuttle and station and had an office full of documents and had moved out of that office, and the people who were going to move into the new office wanted all that stuff out of there. So they bugged him until he came back, and he didn't have time to deal with it, so he threw all that stuff out. And sometime later he ran into Patty Stockman from the Records Management Office, who was, as I would have been, saddened to hear of this, and he explained that he did not know that the records management folks even existed. So I'm here to tell you that not only do they exist, but they will be overjoyed if you can take your extra copies of notes and transcripts and briefing books, whatever you have that relates to what you are doing, and call them. So the new rule of thumb that I want to leave you with is, when in doubt, call records management. And for those of you who do not have a JSC directory handy, the extension is 31849. Just remember 3 Gold Rush, 1849. And what will you accomplish if you do what I'm suggesting? if you contribute what is today your working papers and your reference books and all of that sort of thing to historians and to records managers, I can tell you that you will be contributing to something that is every bit as important as building a new spacecraft or designing a new piece of equipment, because you will be contributing the parts and pieces of the story. And without those records, there can be no true history. And without the history, we lose the greater meaning of what you are doing here. The countless decisions and thought processes and conversations that add up into making a dream, like going to the moon or building a permanent outpost in Earth orbit, making dreams like that into reality. That represents the wonder of human ingenuity, and which the space program has always epitomized. And that is a story that I found to be worth telling, and that I'm confident will continue to be worth telling. So thank you, and I will be happy to take any questions that you may have.